Good morning. Bonjour. Thank you, Heidi, and I'm delighted to be here. And what I would like to do is to share with you some of the things we've been learning about ADHD. Now, I understand there are a few people here who've heard me speak before. I hope you won't be bored. Some of it is going to be information that I've talked about in other settings at other times. It's not as though everything is all brand new every time we turn around. But even if you have heard me speak before, I think you will find some things that I'm going to be talking about here that you may not have heard me talk about before. So let's go ahead. We've been changing our understanding about what ADHD is about. Incidentally, I'll use the terms ADD and ADHD interchangeably throughout this talk. I'm not trying to indicate subtypes. If I am, I'll be more specific about that. But you know, this disorder was originally described in the medical literature around 1902 with an article in the Lancet, a medical journal in London. But the emphasis on it throughout the years has been largely on little kids who couldn't sit still, wouldn't shut up, and were driving everybody nuts. And it wasn't really until 1980, largely headed by efforts in the research of Virginia Douglas from here in Canada, that the description of this disorder began to use the terms attention deficit disorder. And it was at that time in 1980 when it was finally changed in DSM, as DSM-3 came out, to recognize that it comes with and without hyperactivity, and that was the beginnings of acknowledging that this is a disorder which tends to persist into adulthood. Well, they messed the whole thing up in 1987 when the DSM-3R came out, and they sort of mushed all this stuff together so that we lost the predominantly inattentive type. That got changed sort of in 1994, but you'll notice I've got 2000 down as what I think of as sort of a turning point in our beginning to get a different picture of this disorder through the research. And this is not a change which is official by any means. In fact, we were just talking here at the table before we began about the DSM-5, which will be coming out in a couple more years, they say. And the question was, well, are they going to start talking about executive function? Because that's the direction that the research is leading us to understand this disorder. And from what I can see, I'm not part of the committee that's doing that, thank God, but it doesn't look like they're going to be using that language at all. It's a very political process, and it's going to take a while, but the reality is, regardless of what the manual says, the reality is that we are learning to think about ADHD no longer as primarily a behavior disorder, because we know there are a lot of people who have ADD who've never had any significant behavioral problems. And even for those who have, that's usually the least of it as they're growing up. The problems are predominantly things that have to do with attention. And when you start talking about attention broadly conceived, we're talking about executive function. And so that's the emphasis I'd like to make. First, let's just review a few basic facts. I think most of you are probably familiar with these, but just so we all have the same database. The incidence of ADHD, if you measure it with the same diagnostic criteria, doesn't vary much around the world. I've now been in 40 countries over the course of the last 10 years talking with people about this. And when you use the same diagnostic criteria, which doesn't always happen, it turns out to be someplace in the general vicinity of about 5 to 10%, and the most recent US estimates epidemiologically are about 9% of kids. That's a lot of kids. And the data that we've got at this point, which are not wonderful, but it's better than we had before, indicates that at least 4.5% of adults fully meet those diagnostic criteria as well, even though the diagnostic criteria that we currently have were not designed primarily for adults. And we know that in the old days, everybody said, oh, this is primarily a boys' problem, 6 boys for every 1 girl. But you know where they got that number? They counted kids being dragged into child guidance clinics. And when they went out and did epidemiological studies where they're going knocking on doors in neighborhoods, it turns out to be much closer to 3 to 1. But the interesting thing is, throughout the world, in the clinics that are primarily serving adults, the incidence is more like 1 to 1. Now, what does that mean? It means there are a lot of girls and women out there who have these difficulties who are not being identified because they're not making that much trouble for people usually. And so parents and teachers are not pushing them to get something done about it until they get into university or they get a little bit older and are in a position where they can bring themselves in for evaluation. And I think what we're going to find is as we begin to look at this disorder in the broader terms of executive function, that we're going to be seeing much more clearly that this is an equal opportunity problem. It crosses all levels of IQ. I'll be talking a little later this morning in another presentation about research we've done on folks with high IQ who also have ADD. Cross-cuts all levels of socioeconomic status. I treat people for this who are professors at Yale University and other universities around the world, doctors and lawyers, big shots in business. A lot of people, regular folks, some people have trouble doing the basics. You can be anything from retarded to a genius and still have ADD. It has nothing to do with how smart you are. There's a lot of interesting work that's been done on genetics, but the basic message of it is there is no one gene which is responsible for ADHD. There are a number of genes that are involved, but they seem to be many different genes contributing and not just one single gene. But we do know that this is highly heritable. Out of every 4 people diagnosed with ADHD, one of them is going to have a mom or dad who's got it, whether they know it or not. And the other 3, if they don't have a parent who has it, usually they have a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt or a cousin or a brother or sister. There's usually somebody that you can thank. But the important thing to keep in mind is this is not inherited by subtype, which is to say you could have a couple of parents who have 3 kids, and one of them may have wildly hyperactive ADHD, another one may have very quiet couch potato type ADHD, and the third one may have no ADHD at all. Some of you may have seen this before, but this is just to make the point that we've got quite a bit of research on the genetics of ADHD. And the big point about it is this heritability. In science, we use a number between 0 and 1. You'll see that along the bottom line of this chart to indicate how much genes contribute to a particular thing, in this case ADHD. Where 0 means not much at all, and 1 means that's pretty much the whole story. And you can see on the left axis the numbers on a number of different studies. We've got more that have been done since this slide was made. But if you take a look at the research data, what you'll find is that when we're looking at the data for height, it's about 0.9. Height is highly heritable. Schizophrenia about 0.7. Asthma is about 0.4. Breast cancer is pretty close to 0.3. ADHD is way over there at 0.8. And that's based on a lot of twin studies. So we know this is something which is quite heritable. It does tend to run in families.